Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
California's rugged and scenic northwestern corner is the beginning of the great Pacific Northwest. A region of untamed and primitive beauty.
And the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department has now joined efforts with the Arcata Police.
Growers living off the grid. Humboldt County also has the highest rate of missing person cases in the state.
Epicenter of the American marijuana.
There's a lot of evil here. A lot of evil.
This is Kinda Murdery, and you're entering the Emerald Triangle. Wow, that was nuts. Hey everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with me. If you enjoy the show, please do take a moment to follow or subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review. It makes a huge difference. And as you know, if you've listened to the show before, I have cerebral palsy, and it's my hope that Kinda Murdery can become a support community for people with disabilities. If you or someone you know has a disability and is going through a tough time or would just appreciate someone to connect with, please reach out to the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on social media. Now, you may remember a murder story we told from 1919 called The Shotgun Slaying of Frida Beckley. If not, go listen to it. And while the events are horrific, the twists and turns of the story are riveting and irresistible. Now, why am I mentioning this terrible killing that I've already told you about? Because, whoops, I did it again. I found another story about the shotgun murder of a newlywed, and she's also named Frida, and it also happened in the 19-teens. And I'm going to ask you to listen to it, but I think you'll be glad you did. This story reminded me of the talented Mr. Ripley, if, instead of a genius sociopath, Ripley was a mediocre, horny bigamist who thought he was a genius, but was actually suffering from the Dunning-Kruger effect. Today's tale is a study in the Dunning-Kruger effect, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a psychological disorder that causes people to think they are brilliant and competent and an expert, when in fact they are the opposite. Put another way, it's easy answers for simple minds, or even more simply, if you're dumb enough, you think every answer is an easy one. So, prepare yourself for the dastardly deeds of the untalented Mr. Ripley. In fact, this case had an evocative name of its own, not just one that I gave it at the time. In September of 1916, a railway worker at the Grand Trunk Railroad in Muskegon, Michigan, uncovered the badly decomposed body of a young woman, and her identity, and the mystery behind her murder, was dubbed the Boreland Woods Mystery by the residents of Boreland, Crystal Lake, Muskegon, and other communities surrounding the Boreland Woods. Now, you may have figured it out, but today we are nowhere near California's Emerald Triangle. Instead, we're in Michigan's Emerald Hand. I just made that up right now. Michigan is shaped like a hand, and forests are emerald. Send forth the murder heralds to decree henceforth that the woods of west central Michigan shall be known as the Emerald Hand. Now, why are we here? Well, today is a very special day on Kinda Murdery. I am once again reunited with my good friend Nick Viau for no less than the fourth time here on Kinda Murdery. How you doing today, Nick?
I'm doing really good, Zevin. I'm happy to be on here. You know, we have a triangle too. Did you know that?
Oh, you do? No, I did not.
You've never heard of the Great Lakes Triangle?
Oh man, now I feel like I'm unprepared and unprofessional. No, please enlighten me.
Well, you're you're an actual entire continent away, so I don't expect you to know. But actually, and you might want to look into this yourself because I think you'd like this. But the Great Lakes Triangle is a lot like the Bermuda Triangle. We've had a lot of planes, a lot of shipwrecks, and things go down in the Great Lakes within that forms a triangle. And with like Huron, Superior, Michigan, and wow, it's really pretty fascinating.
Sounds super up my alley.
Yeah, things just disappearing without a trace, and the whole Bermuda Triangle thing, but here, so you ought to check that out. But yeah, it's just the Great Lakes Triangle.
So do you think some of it is that those big nasty root balls that you told us about last time you were on, just sinking people willy-nilly, or what's your theory on what's going on here?
They could take a little bit more than a root ball there. I mean, the lakes are a lot bigger than than a lot of people think, though.
They're basically oceans, right?
They basically are. Lake Superior is the scariest thing that it's super deep, super cold, and really eerie. They've got some great shipwreck museums up there. There's been a lot of shipwrecks in Lake Superior, but It's mainly because November is so crazy.
Wow.
With the waves and everything like that, and the straits and everything like that get crazy too. So I mean, it's a lot. People think lake, but they're not a lake. Like,
in honor of you, because you're my favorite Michigander, this is the very first story we've told this season that has absolutely nothing to do, even tangentially, with the state of California. I told one that was Nevada, but that was because there's a Humboldt County in Nevada, and I'm from Humboldt County, California, and I found this great story, and I'd learned too much of it before I realized it was Humboldt County, Nevada, because I'm an idiot. But I was trying to tell a California story, so this is the first time we've completely left California, and now we're officially adopting Michigan, or I guess more accurately, Kinda Murdery is asking Michigan to adopt us. Please, Michigan, will you be Daddy Warbucks to our little orphan Annie? Please, Michigan. California's an unfit parent.
We're pretty welcoming to a point, so you might be all right. I don't know. I get made fun of a lot for being from Michigan from West Coast people, but
really,
yeah,
I think it's
all
cool,
good.
man.
Yeah. No, they think we're backwards and racist. That's the whole thing over here. We're not all like that. So
in any backwoods, and I grew up in backwoods myself, there are lots of racists in the backwoods, but that doesn't
right, that's
mean
literally what your podcast is about.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that everyone is backwards and racist, but there are racists in the backwoods, that's for sure.
And you could be backwoods without being backwards.
Yeah, you can. Yes, you can, and I like to think that describes my family. But I did go to elementary school with the daughter of a guy who, well, his father was in the actual SS, and he was an unabashed Holocaust-denying Nazi who lived in the woods, had a German Shepherd that used to run wild and kill everybody's sheep, and he grew a lot of pot back when it was never legal, and all of his pot grows were down by the river, so if you were swimming in the river and you went around the wrong bend, pretty soon there were bullets whistling past your head. So that's an example of a backwoods racist in California. So yeah, don't give Michigan a bad name, guys. They're everywhere. The racists in the backwoods, I mean.
We got weed too. We're civilized.
I bet you do.
We have marijuana.
I bet you do.
Yes, it's legal. Indeed. We got green thumbs here. Really green thumbs. But anyway, you found, you just picked a random Michigan story, and I've never heard of this.
That's kind of awesome and amazing. And by the way, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Muskegon is too far from Sheboygan, is it? Isn't it kind of your neck of the woods we're talking about?
No, Muskegon is. But remember, I live in Grand Rapids now.
That's
right. I'm from
Sorry.
Sheboygan originally. My family's all in Sheboygan, but I'm in Grand Rapids, Michigan now, and I work at Grand Valley State University, which is in Allendale, Michigan, and we actually have a research facility in Muskegon, the Annis Water Research.
As obsessed as I am personally with water research, we should probably get onto the story, but I do have some questions I want to ask you about lake monsters, so we'll get back to this. As we always try to do here on Kinda Murdery, if we're going to tell a murder story, we should start with the person who deserves our remembrance and our sympathy, and that is the murder victim. There's too much idolizing of killers in our culture in terms of treating them almost like amoral superheroes, and so let's try not to do that, and instead let's talk about the poor young woman who had her life taken, and her name was Frida Weichmann. Now, who was Frida Weichmann? She was born Frida Luckow in Chicago in 1894. When she was still a very young girl, her mother passed, and her father, Gustav Luckow, who struggled with addiction, couldn't care for her, so she briefly became a ward of the state before being adopted and raised by her aunt. Her aunt features prominently in this story and is referred to only as Mrs. Clinky, but her surname must have been Weichman when she adopted Frida, because that is the surname that Frida took. And to her great misfortune, she was destined to become Frida Sheldon, or actually Frida Piper. And why is it that I don't know the victim's married last name? Well, I know it, but you see, that last name confusion is the crux of this whole story, and so we'll get into that a little bit later. Little is known of Frida Weichman's childhood, but she grew up to be a gorgeous and extremely athletic brunette, attractive enough that her likeness was a staple in the papers around the time of her killer's apprehension. Not a lot of newspaper articles had photos in 1919, but if you investigate this case, you'll see that the vast majority of them had pictures of Frida Weichman in them, and I think that's because attractive women sell newspapers. It's still true today. So as I mentioned, not just looks, but athleticism. Now, the history of professional tennis in the United States is a topic for another researcher and another show, so I can't tell you exactly how a person made money playing tennis as a young woman in 1914, but Frida Weichman was a Chicago club, by which I believe they mean blue blood private clubs for wealthy people, a Chicago club tennis champion who had amassed winnings by the time she met our villain of as much as $8,000. Now that's $231,000 today adjusted for inflation. Pretty nice nest egg for a 26-year-old orphan, I'd say. What do you think, Nick?
Yeah, that is. The newspaper thing is super interesting too.
Yeah. She was a little orphan Annie, and she was her own Daddy Warbucks, so that's awesome. I mean, especially in 1914, you don't hear about that much. I mean, this is a pretty badass young woman. I gotta ask you, Nick, because this is the first thing I thought of when I saw how much money she had at that age, and then adjusted it for inflation with the handy dandy Google calculator and the whole deal. When you were a little kid, not when you were 26, but when you were a little kid, do you have a memory, like how much money did you think was like a lot of money when you were little, like say when you were 8 or 10 or something?
8 or 10? Oh boy. I'm going to go with I want to say $500.
See, you were much more sophisticated than me then, because for some reason, and now when I was about 6, 7, 8 years old, my allowance was 50 cents a week, and it wasn't just an allowance. It came with chores. It was like, clean your room, bring in the firewood, XYZ, and then here's your 50 cents a week. So I have a very clear... What?
Damn, dude, you got ripped off.
I know, I did. It was enough to buy one pack of baseball cards if the shop owner who liked me because I was a cute little kid didn't charge me tax.
You know, though,
basically.
I will say this, though. I did a lot of work for my dad down at our clothing store, and he paid me basically in hockey cards and comic books. So that really isn't that far off, you know, $1, but not per week. That might have been one day. That's sweatshop labor.
To be somewhat fair, I guess, I did grow up in the middle of the woods an hour from town, so I only went to town once a week. But still, I mean, even that young, I was pretty aware that 50 cents was not enough, and having to save up my 50 cents for a month to buy one comic book was a little rough. But anyhow, my parents listen to the show. Love you, Mom and Dad. And the point is, I remember very clearly having this thought. It's like a foundational memory for me. And the thought was this: if I just had $10, like 10 whole dollars all my own, I'm like the people from A Million Ways to Die in the West being like, show some respect, boy, that's $1. I
love that movie.
Yeah, I do too. Very underrated, everybody. But if I just had $10, I would have all the money I needed in the world. I thought I would be Elon Musk. I would have an unquenchable amount of money if I just could get my hands on a full $10. So that was the amount of money I thought was a lot.
Yeah, I had you beat there a little bit. But, I think there was a reason why I thought $500 was a lot of money. I think around now I'm thinking more around the age of 10. I mean, we had some gaming systems and stuff out there then too. Mm-hmm. But I think I was I hardcore wanted an electric guitar. in like an electric.
That's a good reason.
Yeah, and I remember going down to the music store. I might have been around 11 actually, but and the guy was trying to sell me on some like 80s metal guitar and like an amp, and I just remember it being like $500, and my mom and dad like giving me my aunt's acoustic and having me learn on that before they would spend that kind of money to help me get a guitar. But yeah, that's why. So otherwise, I still thought $10 was a lot of money too. If you have $10, my kids today, if they have $10, they think they're loaded. So,
well, Frida Weichmann didn't have much as a kid, but as we've discussed, by the time she was a young woman, she'd earned nearly $250,000 in tennis victory winnings. Now that I've introduced you to Frida, it's time to meet the protagonist, or really the antagonist of this story. The guy who makes everything happen, for better or worse, actually for much worse. It's not a question. And of course, I'm talking about the untalented Mr. Ripley, our middlingly intelligent killer, Milo Piper, bigamist. Now, you know how attorneys might have a card that says, like, Nick Viau, Esquire? Professionals, for some reason, I picture this guy with a little card says Milo Piper, bigamist. And I'll get into that. So here's the story. Milo Piper is an insurance salesman in Muskegon, Michigan. He's married to a woman named Iva Goodnow, and they have a 3-year-old kid. He is unhappy with his lot in life, or I don't know if it's a midlife crisis or if he's just a sociopath or some combination of both. But what he does is he gradually embezzles postage stamps from his workplace at a speed at which no one notices.
We got another postage stamp thief?
We do, and in this case, the postage stamps enable actual murder.
How the hell do I get the postage stamp?
I know, right?
What a racket.
It's so wild because what it tells me is that, today, obviously, our money supply is out of control. Inflation's out of control because since the start of the pandemic, they've printed close to a quarter or a third of the total amount of money printed in America since the founding of America. So for us, money is everywhere, physically, digitally. I mean, you may not have it. When I say it's everywhere, I mean it's commonplace, right? You might walk out to the parking lot at the grocery store and see a dime on the ground or something. Well, back at the dawn of the 20th century, actual physical money, I think, was pretty relatively rare, because I run across these stories all the time about people paying for things, buying things with postage stamps and stealing postage stamps. And in fact, postage stamps have never been legal tender in the United States. You cannot actually, with the blessing and full backing of the United States government, buy anything with postage stamps. Now, Nick, you probably know this because you're a Civil War buff, but they did pick up some cachet as currency during the Civil War, particularly in the Confederacy, because their money was so unstable and functionally worthless that people would hoard postage stamps and use them like paper money because they did have an ascribed value for a known service. And so it's the same thing here in the year 1915. Good old Milo Piper, or I should say bad old Milo Piper, a.k.a. Otto Sheldon, what a name to make up for yourself, gradually steals like a couple $1,000 worth of postage stamps from the insurance company that he works for, which tells me that even in 1915, your Geicos and whatever of the worlds were sending out way too much obnoxious junk mail, because he's actually able to embezzle a couple $1,000 worth of postage stamps without anybody noticing.
Dude, I just got that Johnny Cash song in my head, though, that one piece at a time.
So
he's doing that walk down the street,
Yeah.
He's got his postage stamps in his pocket.
So he takes the train to Chicago with his satchel, wheelbarrow, whatever, steamer trunk full of postage stamps, and he pays a couple $1,000, which is a ton, but probably he had to overpay because he was paying in postage stamps for an automobile. Now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think cars have only been around for a couple years at this point. But, so we're talking, it's probably a Ford Model A. But he spends about $2,000 in postage stamps from, I imagine, a pretty shady character.
From stamp to Model A, that's like that. You got the paper clip, and then you trade it up and end up with a house.
Yeah. So this is all, by the way, this is all true story. This is vetted and re-vetted from multiple sources, both at the time and then later in like the 1950s when they're revisiting interesting cases and stuff like that. So he buys this car with a couple grand worth of postage stamps. And while he's in Chicago, he sees these girls playing tennis in the park. And he goes and he's watching these girls play tennis. And one of them in particular is A, super good at tennis, and B, very beautiful. And he zeroes in on her. And he also sees that she looks like she's probably got some money. I mean, you can usually tell, we all have kind of some radar for when you see somebody out in public, the quality of their clothes, how put together they are, their jewelry, their shoes, whatever. You can usually get a pretty good sense of whether you're looking at somebody with a couple of nickels to rub together or not. And so, as an insurance salesman / con man, he sees his mark. He's like, wow, beautiful young girl, looks like she's got money. And he himself at this point is able to present as though he has a lot of money because he's now got a nice new car. He's an insurance salesman. He's slick. He's got good clothes. In fact, he's deeply in debt, but he's able to present as a society gentleman. In other words, he's a textbook flim-flam man. So he goes up and he introduces himself to Frida Weichmann, and he just starts aggressively wooing her. He takes her out on date after date. They go out like 6 days in a row. And then on the 7th day, she takes him home. She lives at a boarding house for working young women run by a man named Charles White, but it's a super upscale boarding house in a fancy neighborhood. And then he proposes marriage, and he says, I love you, marry me. I'm going to take you all over America in my new fancy car. And then we're even going to drive down to South America. We're going to see the world, baby. Also, and I imagine most of you saw this coming, he convinces Frida to withdraw her $8,000 from the bank so that she has money with her on this extended traveling honeymoon they're going to take. Guy had a lot of faith in a Model A Ford. He's going to take it on the Trans-American Highway in 1915.
Dude, this guy embezzled stamps and ended up with a car.
Ended up with a car and a smoking hot tennis champion.
Smoking hot tennis player. This guy's got humongous balls.
Really? I mean, okay, he's a horrible, horrible, horrible person.
His name's Milo.
But yes, it's true that Milo Piper started as a bankrupt insurance broker like 2 weeks ago, then ran off with a trunk full of stamps, ended up with a brand new car and a hot, rich girlfriend, a wife. But meanwhile, of course, this morally bankrupt bastard has his actual wife and actual 3-year-old child back in Muskegon, Michigan. So he's just not worrying about that already married, already have a family detail. He's like, shoot, I'm buying cars with stamps. Nothing can stop me.
Nobody's checking up on any of that.
Oh, man.
Everything's just at face value. They're just letting anybody marry anybody. And
well, no. So actually, she, after introducing him to her landlord / father figure, she then introduces him to her aunt, who raised her, and begs the aunt to let her marry him. And she just seems so happy and overjoyed and ready to start her life. And Milo Piper is a smooth, handsome, apparently very successful, because he apparently has not only the car, but the money to take her on a trip all over America and then to South America. So it seems like this sort of Prince Charming dream come true, because remember, we're talking about a young woman who, her mother died. Her father was an alcoholic and a drug abuser. She was a ward of the state. She was raised by her aunt. I mean, she had a lot of things stacked against her, and she grew up into this very impressive young woman, and now along comes her handsome knight in a Model A Charger, And so the fairy tale story seems to be going exactly how our collective cultural zeitgeist might expect it to. And she's certainly bought into that. And she's so overjoyed that the aunt relents and gives them permission to marry. And just like it's always darkest before the dawn, perhaps it's always lightest before the night or something, because, you know, stuff doesn't get better from here. They get married in Rensselaer, Indiana. They're married in Rensselaer, Indiana by Reverend Cornish. And then they start on their tour of America in the brand new car. And this, besides the fact that he's already a con man and already pretending to be somebody he's not, which is kind of talented Mr. Ripley-ish, here's where we start to get into untalented Mr. Dunning-Kruger effect. And if this story wasn't so terrible, this would be kind of funny because of how just kind of blatantly stupid it is. And yet, Milo Piper clearly thinks that he has Neo in the Matrix hacked the system and figured out how to do super shady stuff and ultimately commit murder without getting caught. So if I do chuckle, allow me to chuckle at the idiocy of this monstrous murdering asshole. So here's what he does, Nick. They go to the next town in Illinois after leaving Chicago for their honeymoon, and they go to register at the hotel, because back then, if you had any money and you were known at all, you always registered. And not only did you register, but a lot of times your name got printed in the newspaper, which is sort of terrifying from a privacy and safety standpoint to us today. But I find all the time when I'm reading about these historical stories that there will actually be a section of the newspaper that will be like, Mr. and Mrs. Piper arrived in town today. They're staying at this hotel in room whatever. Like it's a news story that a visitor came. Maybe not
really?
So. Yeah. Now, maybe not in Chicago, maybe not in New York so much, unless you're like a Vanderbilt or something. But in the smaller towns, yes, it's a news story, and they announce you, and people wanted that because it was stature, it was status. So they go to register at this hotel. Milo convinces Frida that it'll be a hilarious prank if they sign into the hotel under pseudonyms. The pseudonyms are Otto and Mrs. Sheldon. Frida agrees, and they walk in laughing. He also convinces her that it's this superstition that his grandmother has, that for a relationship to go well, for a marriage to be a happy one, the bride should sign into the first hotel on the first night by herself. And remember, he's already told her, hey, and wouldn't it be funny if we signed it with a totally different name? Let's not be Mr. and Mrs. Piper. Let's be Mr. and Mrs. Otto Shelton.
Otto Shelton. Like, do you think you got that from the car? Like, Otto.
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, I left out a detail, which was when he traveled to Chicago with his trunk full of stamps to buy the car, he also brought with him a shotgun, his shotgun. So maybe he named himself after the car.
Interesting.
And the shotgun.
Very interesting.
shells.
I was like, well, was Shelton like a brand of shotgun or something? But
Yeah.
no, that could be. Could be that dumb, could he?
So he says, let's be Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sheldon.
My God.
And he treats this all like it's this fun game and joke, like he doesn't really give a reason. He's just affable and silly, and she's loving it too. And yeah, isn't this funny? Let's just have this be our thing. This is our inside baseball funny thing that we do. We're Mr. and Mrs. Otto Shelton. And so she's signing in. And as she's signing in, Milo Piper walks up and he signs in as well underneath Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sheldon. He signs Milo Piper, chauffeur. And then he says to the hotel clerk, oh yeah, we have a chauffeur. We're driving around the country to celebrate our wedding. I have a chauffeur. I sent him on an errand. It's probably going to take him a few hours to get back, to sort of allay any suspicions of like, who's this third person? So this becomes the thing that he does. Every place that they go, and they travel all over America, every hotel that they stay in, they're Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sheldon and Milo Piper, chauffeur. Wow. So you can see what his plan is here. The way in which he thinks that he's broken the Matrix is there's a married couple traveling around the country, and I, Milo Piper, the actual guy who will have to answer for anything that happens and has an actual wife and child back in Muskegon, Michigan, I'm just their chauffeur. That's what I'm here doing. You see, Mr. Idiot Savant Dunning-Kruger here thinks that he's created the perfect alibi, that he can be the guy who was there. He can be the guy that had means, and he can be the guy that had opportunity. But he was just an employee and therefore would have no motive, and no one would ever figure out that he actually did anything because he's just the chauffeur. And he's thinking to himself, I'm a freaking genius. So meanwhile, he's conning his young bride. He's gotten her to advance to him, give to him her $8,000. He basically got it from her before they left Chicago. She took it out of the bank to take on their amazing trip. And they are traveling around, and they actually run out of money. And so next thing you know, they're writing to the aunt to have her send the money, and she does because it's her essentially daughter. And the troubling thing to Frida's aunt is the evolution or de-evolution of the letters that she receives from her niece. And you can probably guess the way that it goes because they're traveling for months. And it starts with, I've never been so happy in my life. I'm living a dream. I'm Cinderella. And then eventually, the last couple letters she gets are essentially something to the effect of, I think my new husband is sick of me already. Well, one day in late summer of 1916, Otto Piper, even I got tricked by his name trick, Milo Piper, returns to Muskegon with a new car and a shotgun and no bride, except for his actual wife, who's at home with the kid being like, so where have you been for the last forever? Guy must have been one hell of a smooth talker, though, because he essentially moves back in and reconciles with his wife, and he goes back and he gets his old job back at the insurance company. So I guess they still haven't uncovered his stamp fraud. Meanwhile, just to set the timeline here, Milo Piper and Frida were married in 1915. Then they traveled around for close to a year before the money ran out. They started with her money, the $8,000 she'd won playing tennis. They ended up asking the aunt for money, which she sent because Frida was essentially her daughter. In truth, they never spent Frida's money. She only thought they did. And Milo started instructing her to ask her aunt for money to cover up the fact that he had embezzled the life savings of his new bride because he was broke when he left Muskegon. And when he returned with nothing but the car and the shotgun, it was later discovered that he had $7,000 in the bank. And the dark foreshadowing of it all was the evolution or devolution of Frida's letters, which went from, I'm so happy, I'm over the moon, my life is a fairy tale, to the last couple of them, I'm so sad and I think my new husband is sick of me. So Milo Piper, after disappearing to Chicago in the middle of 1915, returns to Muskegon in 1916. He's still got the car, he's still got the shotgun, but of course, no Frida. Now, he must have been one hell of a smooth customer, because what does he do? He goes straight home. He reconciles with his wife. I guess he's like, oh, hey, kid who's 3 and whose year and a half of your life I just didn't experience at all. I'm your dad. And hi, honey, I'm home. And then he goes and he gets his old job back at the insurance company, which is also incredible. I guess they never figured out he took all those stamps.
What is going on here? Like,
right. What is going on?
The negligence and this guy must have been, you're right, being a smooth talker.
Yeah, I mean, some con people, from what I understand, lucky for me, I've never experienced it, but can truly be that magnetic. I don't know if anybody's seen Nightmare Alley, but I keep thinking of Bradley Cooper's character, the mentalist flim flam man. But yeah, he convinces everybody, takes him back, his wife, his employer. But meanwhile, obviously Frida is missing, and Frida's aunt is certain that something horrible has happened, because she and only she at this point has saw all of Frida's letters. So she saw the progression from happiness to despair, and she feels in her heart, she knows that something terrible must have happened. But men in America, even today, are very subconsciously sexist. Whenever we'd have work done on our house and we hire tradespeople, ultimately wonderful people, of course, but my wife in our relationship is the one who knows everything about like home design and remodeling, and she'll tell a carpenter or a plumber or a drywall guy, whatever, exactly what needs to be done, and they'll spend 20 minutes telling her why it can't be done that way and why it's not possible to do it that way. So I'll come over and I'll go, hey honey, tell me exactly what to say, and she'll literally give me the words like Cyrano de Bergerac, and I'll go over and say, hey, you guys, you need to do this. Yes, sir, right away, sir. It's happened now too many times for me to even count. So why am I bringing that up? That's a metaphor for the fact that for a long time, from the moment she got the last despaired letter, Frida's aunt is banging a gong with anyone who will listen. Police, town leaders, sheriffs, anyone who will listen. My niece has disappeared. I'm afraid she's been murdered. Please, God, you have to help me find her. And she just gets dismissed. Like, go away, crazy lady. You told us she ran away with her new husband. So she ran away with her new husband. Because, of course, Frida's aunt doesn't know that Milo Piper's back in Muskegon. She just knows that she hasn't heard from Frida in over a year. So she's going to people and she's begging them to look for Frida and take her seriously. And they're just telling her she's probably in South America. Like, she told you she was going to South America because, see, Milo plotted this whole thing out from the start. In some ways, he was a real dumbass. He got a couple things right, though, because in 1915... if you're in South America, nobody's getting in touch with you, right? But then finally in September of 1916, Frank Connor, the foreman of the Grand Trunk Railroad in Muskegon, Michigan, which I think has got to be the railroad that the Grand Funk Railroad took their name from, right? It's got to be.
There's Michigan connections there, so who knows,
Yeah,
man?
Detroit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so Frank Connors is on his lunch break out in the woods. I mean, who knows what he's up to? Maybe he's taking a dump. Maybe he's upset. So he's on his lunch break, and he's wandering around in the Boreland woods. Now, I know that Boreland and Muskegon are not that close together. They're about an hour apart, I think. But he works for the railroad, so he was probably down the tracks. He's wandering through the Boreland woods, and he trips over like a hump on the forest floor. And he's like, what is that? And what it turns out to be is the badly decomposed body of Frida. But nobody knows that yet. For now, it's just an unidentified body, and it's so badly decomposed that they have no idea who it is, and no way or idea to how to figure out who it is. Here's where the first break comes. Months before she was killed, Frida had written not just to her aunt, but to one of her friends in Chicago. And in that letter, she mentioned Milo Piper in Muskegon. So she tells the friend that she's married this great guy named Milo Piper, and he's from Muskegon, Michigan. All these months of nothing go by, and the friend, like the aunt, is worried about Frida. So when there's a report of an unidentified woman's body in the newspaper that was found near Muskegon, the friend thinks to herself, oh my God, my friend's missing. She married some guy on a whim from Muskegon. Maybe this is her. So the friend takes the train down from Chicago. She goes to Milo Piper's house because everybody was listed in the phone book back then. And she meets Mrs. Piper. And of course discovers that Mrs. Piper is in fact Milo's original wife, Ida, not her dear friend Frida. Next, she goes to the coroner and the police and asks to see the body, and is able to identify Frida based on the remnants of her clothing and whatever jewelry or possessions were still sort of on the body. And then immediately they get in touch with her aunt, who also comes and confirms that in fact it is Frida's body.
Wow. What a terrible feeling.
Can you imagine? Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah, just finding that out and just like, oh, Muskegon. Wait a second.
I know. And then you're like,
I mean,
the whole time you'd be telling yourself, there's no way. I just have to make sure. And then when it actually is, I know. So now they start to investigate. Obviously, they know who it is. So now they talk to the aunt. They know that. So they start to investigate because now they have information to triangulate from both the aunt and the friend. And they know that the couple was married and going to travel the United States. So they start calling around to sheriff's departments in different cities. They find the marriage certificate in Rensselaer, Indiana. They find the reverend who married them. And as they're calling these hotels, they keep getting the same response, which is a Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sheldon with a chauffeur named Milo Piper. Well, obviously, the name Milo Piper rings a little bit of a bell with the Muskegon police. So they go look for him, and they go to his workplace, the insurance company where he works, and they say, don't you have a guy named Milo Piper working here? And the boss says, yeah. And the policeman says, well, where is he? He says, oh, he's one of our salesmen. He's over there. He's on the phone. So the policeman goes over to Milo and he says, so we're investigating the murder of this young woman who married a guy named Otto Sheldon and was apparently driven around the country by a chauffeur named Milo Piper. Do you know who this Milo Piper guy is, Mr. Milo Piper? And we know that Milo Piper is nothing if not bold. The man has nothing if not gall. And he says, yeah, of course I know who Milo Piper, the chauffeur, is. It was me. He says, I drove them all around the country. Otto Sheldon was a guy who sold newspaper subscriptions. He got super rich. He was taking his beautiful young wife all around the country. I'd gotten sick of just being an insurance salesman, so I went to Chicago and got myself this job as a chauffeur so I could see the world too. Then at some point during our travels, his businesses went south. They ran out of money. He couldn't pay me, so naturally I left and came home. Pretty simple. That's how it happened. And initially the police were like, okay, that sounds plausible-ish, right? So here's where, when I called him the untalented Mr. Ripley, right? He thinks he's got this genius plan in place because he can just say, yeah, I don't know what became of the couple. I was the chauffeur. And this was obviously his get-out-of-jail-free card in his mind the entire time. But to make a murder case, right, what are the things that you absolutely must have? You've got to have motive. You've got to have opportunity. You've got to have a body. Now, obviously, they didn't have the body until they found it. The motive is obvious, money. Now, the opportunity, though, is being in the same place at the same time with the victim. And here, when he thought that he was hacking the system with his genius plan, what he actually was doing was creating a record that he was absolutely in each of these places with the murdered woman for all of this time. Meanwhile, she is sending home letters to her aunt that he is not forbidding her to send and not censoring, that are getting progressively grimmer and grimmer. Again, everyone, please know that if it sounds like I'm enjoying this, I'm enjoying the smug arrogance and fatal mistakes of a heinous murderer, not the terrible things that he does. So, the aunt gets a letter dated on a particular date that says, I think my husband's sick of me, this is a nightmare. And right there on that same date, he has created proof that he was there with her with ample motive and opportunity to murder her.
Exactly. So even if there's Otto Shelton, so if there is an Otto Shelton, there's no body for Otto Shelton. So
Right.
How could he think that they would just assume that, okay, he killed Otto Shelton too. Now we got to find Otto Shelton.
Right.
Like, I don't and here's the other thing. I got to back you up for a second.
Please do.
Because, did she tell her surrogate mother that she married Otto Shelton? Did the mother not know that his name was Milo Piper?
She and the family, everybody knew that he was Milo Piper.
Okay.
He just started doing the Otto Shelton thing, signing into hotels, and convinced her it was just like a joke. They were doing it on a lark.
So these letters, though, was she referring to him as Milo or just my husband? Like,
yeah, I'm not sure. And where you're going with this is...
Yeah, it's freaking Milo Piper, like, immediately. Like, yeah, this Milo Piper guy, like, you know?
Well, I think the answer is that nobody knew Frida was dead. Nobody knew where she was. Nobody knew where he was either until he showed up back in Muskegon, and the aunt had no idea he was back in Muskegon until she heard from the friend that the unidentified body belonged to Frida.
Okay.
There was no crime to investigate until the body got identified. So that's
Gotcha.
the explanation.
The other thing I was thinking is, like, why didn't he? Okay, so for one, he was already married. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew about that.
Mm-hmm.
Why couldn't he have just been Otto Shelton the whole time? Why couldn't he have been Otto Shelton? You know what I mean? Not Otto Shelton and Milo Piper. He could have just been Otto Shelton. Everybody would have known he's Otto Shelton. He already convinced her that they were going to do this thing. He could have been Otto Shelton to the surrogate mother, whatever this was. She's not going to know him from Milo. So...
Right.
Why even come up with all that?
This is where I was calling him the stupidest, like, genius in the world. He thought he was a genius. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. The reason he did that was he thought he was creating an alibi for himself, Milo Piper. In other words, if he had just said he was Otto Shelton, then once they figured out Otto Shelton was a pseudonym, they would have been like, okay, well, when we find Otto Shelton, we will find the killer. And then when they found Otto Shelton, they would find Milo Piper, and they would have their killer. This is why I called him an idiot. In his mind, he was existing as this innocent third party, and he was all affable, and all of the hotel employees knew who he was. And he couldn't possibly have killed her because in the official record, he's not the husband. He's just the chauffeur.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
He was creating Otto Sheldon so that there was never a murderer to find. That's how he thought it was going to work. That's why I called him an idiot. I mean, he's an absolute idiot. And the idea that you think, because in order to think that's going to work, you have to think, oh my God, I've got it. Like, I figured this out. You go, how come nobody else in the last 5,000 years of humanity has figured out how to get away with murder like this? All you have to do is sign your name as someone else, say you're a chauffeur who's never around, and then when she gets killed by the husband, you just get, yes, I was there. Yes, I was with her. Yes, I had motive and opportunity, but I was there because I was the chauffeur. And he thought that was going to work. He must not have been around police too often in his life, because if there's one thing that I've learned from researching a lot of true crime stories, it's that the law is going to investigate the hell out of whoever they've got. That's what Milo didn't consider. Whenever they catch a murderer, they then call every police department in about 100-mile radius and say, okay, what unsolved murders do you have? We got this guy. We know he's a murderer. Come down, talk to him. See if he killed whoever is outstanding in your department. Once they get a hold of you, they're going to find out everything. So the problem with Milo's brilliant plan, or I guess he was such an irrationally confident con man, that he thought that they would get a hold of him and then just agree with him. Oh, yeah, of course. You were just the chauffeur, of course. Like, we've got you. We've got a dead girl. We have nothing but your explanation that you suddenly decided to become a chauffeur to suggest that you didn't kill her.
When
of course, they're going to figure it out.
He went away and joined the army or something.
Right.
Like,
right. Also,
wild.
Also, you had to be so wealthy at that time you're going to marry a girl, buy a car, and drive around the country for months. And he was temporarily wealthy because he stole all the money from the wife and her aunt. But in reality, if there really was a newspaper magazine salesman, businessman who was so well off that he could tour the country for months with his new wife, that would be Otto Shelton. I think somebody would know that he existed in one of those towns. Somebody would be like, oh yeah, my uncle works for Otto Shelton because he's so damn successful. You know?
Right? Yeah.
There's some very obvious logical thought processes that Milo just doesn't consider at all. He just in his brilliant plan to get away with it, which he clearly plotted from the very start to get away with it. He was always planning to steal all their money and then go back to his original life. So she must have just assumed
that he had his own money too.
Well, that's right, because he showed up with a new car.
Right.
He presented himself as owning the insurance company, not just being a broker.
There had to have been a point where she was like, wait, why are we asking for money? I thought you had lots of money. So I'm guessing that there was some kind of realization that this guy is completely full of shit. I'm in trouble. And that's when it happened.
If he's like other terrible people like him, the point at which she started to go, hey, wait, why are we asking my aunt for money, is the point at which he started being super cruel to her and saying, I don't love you anymore. I should never have married you. You were the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life, etc., etc. So we probably know when it happened in the sense that it's when the aunt started to get the despairing letters from her, is when she started to ask those questions.
So do you think he drove all the way back to Muskegon? Well, wait a second.
They found her in the Boreland woods, which I believe, and you can correct me, but I believe it's about an hour and a half away from Muskegon. Yes.
So, but it's in Michigan though. So so he returned to Michigan. So that's what I'm trying to figure out. Did he kill her? He must have killed her in Michigan then.
Yeah. Here's what happened. He gives his explanation to the police that he was just a chauffeur. Initially, they sort of have to buy it because they can't initially prove that it's a lie, even though they clearly think that it is. But they question him extensively, and they ask him about all the different towns that he visited with the Sheldons. And he tells them about all the different towns, because in every case they call the hotel and it's Otto and Mrs. Sheldon and chauffeur Milo Piper. Well, there was one town they stayed in where they arrived late at night, and it was raining, and she was tired, and she was wet, and he was tired, and he was wet, and they were fighting, and they were unhappy, and they just wanted to get into the room, and he forgot to sign in as Mr. and Mrs. Sheldon, and they just signed in as Milo Piper and Frida Piper. Well, when he mentions the name of that town to the sheriff, and the name of that town was Warrensburg, Missouri. When he mentions the name of Warrensburg, Missouri to the sheriff, he instantly remembers what happened and realizes he made a big mistake, and he sort of freezes. And the policeman sees that too. And the policeman says, well, what is it? And he goes, I told you about Warrensburg, Missouri, and I made a huge mistake. And now the police are like, oh, well, yeah, you sure did. It sounds like you're about to confess to murder. You made a huge mistake. All your lies are unraveling, you mean? But Milo, the con man, is still quick on his feet. And he goes, oh, no, it's not that. Mr. and Mrs. Sheldon were fighting. And meanwhile, over these months that I was driving them around, Mr. Sheldon was kind of a brute. Look at me, I'm handsome, I'm charming. Mrs. Sheldon was young. She fell in love with me. And she started pressuring me and advancing and pushing herself on me. This guy has nothing but gall. So here's how he explains it. He says, they got in a big fight. The husband stormed off. She said, let's go to a hotel. I want you. Take me now. And he, being a weak, venal man, succumbed to the seduction and went and banged the boss's wife. And that's why their real names were in the register, because she signed his surname because they were pretending to be married since they were having an affair that one time.
Oh, he may be an idiot, but he's quick-witted idiot. We came up with that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like a dime novel alibi.
Yeah, well, the whole thing, he must have read a lot of dime novels, because his whole plan from the start was like a dime novel alibi, right? So they don't buy that. They're kind of like, okay, I guess, but they don't arrest him yet because they still don't have grounds to arrest him on. So what does he do? He hops right in his car and he goes on the lam. And this is in the middle of 1916, and he stays on the lam for about 1.5 years. He's on the lam until he's finally captured in Ontario, Canada. Then he gets taken back and put in jail, awaiting charges and trial. So he ran and he was on the lam for 1.5 years. And he's put in jail, but they still don't actually have proof that he killed her. So they exhume Frida's body, which had been so decomposed that originally the coroner did not do an autopsy on it. Then they find 2 giant holes in the back of her skull and the wadding from Milo's shotgun embedded in her skull. Somehow, Milo hears that they found his shotgun wadding in her skull, and he knows that the shotgun is in his house, and now, finally, his goose is cooked. The night guard leaves for a minute. He acts fast, removes his belt, hangs himself, dies by suicide in jail. If you don't think this story is sad enough already, Gustav Luckow, which is a name that you may not remember at this point in the story, but he was Frida's birth father who had to give her up because of his substance abuse issues. And now he's living as a transient. He still never overcame his demons. He's living in a flop house in Chicago, but he hears about his daughter's murder, and then he hears that her murderer has killed himself, and he finds his way into the kitchen, turns on the gas, sticks his head in the oven, and kills himself.
Wow.
Because here was a guy whose life had been completely broken for his entire life, and he probably thought the one good thing that I ever did in this world was to create that beautiful, talented, tennis champion, brilliant girl. And now, not only is she dead, but I'll never get any sense of justice from her killer who's killed himself like a coward too. And so anyway, man, that really bummed me out.
So there's just nothing left. Is, oh dude, this is dark.
So bad. I know. I'm sorry. But how could I not tell the untalented Mr. Ripley? You know what I mean? It was like sometimes these stories are so awful, and yet they have these twists and turns and improbable nonsense that actually really happened in life on Earth that I can't not tell it. I can't look away. I mean, the embezzled $2,000 worth of stamps from his employer to buy a car. Former orphan and ward of the state becomes tennis champion, earns inflation-adjusted in the bank nest egg of $230,000 by age 26, playing tennis in clubs in Chicago. I mean, these are things that don't sound possible. And that's before you even get to Mr. and Mrs. Sheldon and the chauffeur. So, yes, the story's horrible, and forgive me, anyone who feels like it's too horrible. And I mean, even I got a little misty-eyed just now because, you shouldn't have to have a daughter to feel empathetic about stuff, which is what people love to remind people and yell at them for something horrible happens to a woman and some man says, well, I'm a father, so that really affected me. And then on social media, they're like, you don't have to be a parent to be affected. But I think all of us who are parents know that when you're a parent, man, it hurts
totally,
to
man.
think about this.
I got 2 little girls. I mean, everybody who doesn't have kids seems to know what it's like to have kids.
Yeah.
So that's just the way it is, man.
Yeah, I know.
But or they say, "Whoa, I got a dog." It's the same thing.
Oh my God, I've gotten that so many times, and I try to tell myself they mean well. They're saying they're trying to make a connection between the thing that I love the most and the thing that they love the most, and they have no context with which to understand the massive delta between the two things.
Yeah, you love, I love my dog too.
Right.
Like a kid, but that's like a kid. The kid, when you have, a lot of times couples have kids and the kids, the couples have a problem because how can you give so much love to the kid and have anything left for your spouse? It's hard sometimes.
Right.
But yeah, people just don't understand that. It's just not something you could, I get it all the time. Even from family, you just don't get it, you can't know, but it's not really their fault either. Cause they just don't know.
No. And I don't mean to cast any aspersions at anyone. And like you said, I love my dog too. And And I totally understand the depth of that love. I mean, I love my bearded dragon, but let's be honest. When your dog passes away, it's really sad and you cry, and then you go buy another one, like literally buy or adopt another one.
Mm-hmm. This story was like 7 caliber dark and tragic, like on so many levels. But you're right. There's a lot of ridiculous stuff that happened in it. Like, I mean, stuff that shouldn't have been able to happen.
Right. I mean, you shouldn't even be able to buy a car with stamps for starters.
I mean, yeah. And I mean, also he went on the lam with this car. I mean, and no money, or I don't know how he was making money while he's, maybe the exchange rate into Canada was outrageous.
Well, he's very charming and good at getting people to give him money.
That's true. He was a grifter.
Well, and I got to tell you,
right.
I have a family member. She's passed now, God rest her soul. I loved her dearly, still do. But she was a person who got taken in by just full-on single guy con men more than once in her life, who just showed up and charmed the pants out of her, and she gave them all her money. That is actually very common, and that's essentially what he did with Frida, and I would presume that's how he survived on the lam for so long.
Yeah.
The old bigamy trick. I do have, and this has been so dark, I do have one more crazy detail, which will help to continue to explain why I couldn't not tell this story, that pops up down the road, which is, because one thing we haven't talked about at all, and a person that we should also be feeling pretty terrible for, is his poor actual wife, right?
Yeah.
Iva Goodnow. Are you familiar? Is there a place in Michigan called Benton Harbor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Great. Shout out Benton Harbor. So Milo Piper's actual wife, Ida Goodnow, turns out she is Ida Goodnow, a.k.a. Marion Gray. And Marion Gray ran a matchmaking service out of Benton Harbor. And after Milo Piper kills himself, Ida Goodnow, a.k.a. Marion Gray, goes to prison for 2 years for mail fraud because she ran this fake matchmaking service and got people to send her money to set them up with relationships that never came through. And she gets out of prison and she says, Milo Piper was the only man I'll ever love. So he was this insane grifting con man, and so was his actual wife. This whole time we're thinking about her like the poor woman he just abandoned, and yes, and she was actually, like, whether she's a con woman or not, I feel bad for her that he abandoned her and abandoned the kid. And they were obviously a match made in heaven because they both did the same damn thing. And when she gets out of prison, she says, I'll never not be in love with Milo. And again, anybody, if you haven't seen Nightmare Alley, go watch Nightmare Alley. It's a fantastic movie. Guillermo del Toro, Bradley Cooper, Cate Blanchett. But there's a affair between Bradley Cooper and Cate Blanchett, and paraphrasing, one of the things that is said is, I love you because you're just as ugly of a monster as I am, and around each other we can be who we really are. Like, I have this whole other persona that I do for my actual wife, but you are broken in all the same ways that I am, and that's what's beautiful about us. And that sounds to me like was what Milo Piper had with Iva Goodnow, a.k.a. Marion Gray. They were both grifting crooks, and they knew it about each other, and they embraced it, and they loved each other anyway.
Triple swerve.
Yeah. And by the way,
another weird detail.
And by the way, I wondered all along, oh, gosh, I just put another piece together I'm probably going to need to insert somewhere. But when he returns to town and with the car and the gun and no explanation and no Frida, he has a bunch of money. So the reason they were probably, in answer to your question, the reason they were asking the aunt for money is because he stashed hers. He probably said he spent it, but he had it. He comes back to town with something like $7,000. And when he left, he was up to his ears in debt. And so I've been wondering this whole time, and I just put it together, how the hell he came back to town after being gone for so long and just immediately reconciled with his wife. Except find out later they're both con men. Maybe
little collusion, huh?
Maybe this was the actual plan all along. Maybe the wife knew about Frida. Maybe the plan was to get all of Frida's money, not necessarily murder her, or maybe it was to murder her. I think she might have been in on it.
It's a hell of a lot easier to swallow that, because any spouse, I mean, with a kid, and your husband who's in debt comes back after being gone, and you're just like, oh, cool. You gonna take care of this debt now then? All right, awesome. But that's it?
Right.
Like,
what
that's
have you
fine.
been up to?
You don't question it? Like, that's just it? Yeah, exactly.
You've been running a poker game in a monastery? You've been celibate the whole time? You've been earning this $7,000?
I mean, unless he says he was on the road with insurance, or something like that. But still, he had lost his job too, so she could at any point have called and been like, "Where's my husband? Is he still working?" Or the employer, been like, "Hey, where's he at?"
Well, and the fact he was specifically a con person who played on people's feelings of love, and it turns out she was explicitly and specifically a con person who played on people's feelings of love. So there's no way in hell that they didn't both know that about each other.
Gave her like $5,000 in stamps, and she used that to start her fraud business.
Oh my God.
What do I do with all these stamps? I guess I'm going to have to find a mail order love service. That's probably just what I'm going to have to do.
You know what? I don't have those details, but that might have been what happened. Honestly, because she made all this money by sending letters and getting letters back. She might have just been ingenious and been like, well, I got all these stamps. I got to do something with them.
I'd say that's far-fetched, but there's no way that's far-fetched compared to everything else that we just heard. Right. I mean, actually, that all makes a lot of sense. If you got two con men, and you got a bunch of, if that was liquid.
Yeah. Well, it was obviously liquid to somebody because he bought a car with it. But you're totally...
If he's spending the aunt's money, exactly.
You're totally right. It's so funny because this whole time, I thought I had the case more or less figured out, and I was saving this little, little cap on the story, almost like the sitcom thing where it comes back after the commercial for one more joke, even though this is all the furthest thing from a joke. I thought, oh, and by the way, his wife was a con woman too, was just kind of like one more crazy little like cherry on top of a crazy story. And yet, as you've just said, that little fact, which I thought of as wild but didn't really consider the implications of, makes a lot of the other pieces sort of fall into place.
Otherwise it's like this whole thing has been kind of like there's like almost like there's elements of Seinfeld in it. You know what I mean? Just like, could you just see like, with the stamps and the car and the weird alibi. This all sounds like something would happen to Kramer and George.
No, right. Kramer would be the one that thought the chauffeur thing was brilliant. They're never going to catch me. They're never going to catch me, Jerry. George,
at one point,
Then George would be the guy who got willed, $10,000 worth of expired stamps from some great aunt who died down at the car lot yelling at somebody who refuses to sell him a car for stamps. You're totally right.
Totally. Yeah,
You're
and
totally
at one point
right
when we were
that.
talking about this, and actually around the time I found out, we talked about the chauffeur thing, I literally pictured Milo as Cosmo Kramer.
Yeah.
Until it all got really dark, and then I felt really bad.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, none of this is funny.
Still.
None of this is a sitcom. Yes, but that does illustrate, though, just how wild this story is, and again, why I couldn't help but tell it. I couldn't help it. Plus, I wanted to go to Michigan. I wanted to let you guys know that you're just as murdery as everywhere else.
Oh, we definitely are. We definitely are. And it was fun.
Yeah, it sure
was. It
was
was fun to learn something like that.
You know what? Thanks so much for being here, Nick. It's been an absolute blast. Thank you for listening, everybody. If you like the show, please follow, subscribe, leave a review. For Nick Viau, I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
Kinda Murdery, The Emerald Triangle is created, researched, edited, produced, and hosted by Zevin Odelberg, with opening theme by Niall Madden and art by the Gin of Lang. Available now on all podcasting platforms. If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.